So going right into my talk, good evening comrades and friends. Tonight I'm going to be talking about the growing occupation movement that began on Wall Street about a month ago and has galvanized disaffected students, workers, and others into a spontaneous upsurge that we haven't seen in the U.S. for a great deal of time. I will go over different aspects of the movement and major events that have happened throughout the country, giving special emphasis to the experiences of Wall Street and right here at home in Southern California, where I've been able to maintain a consistent involvement with Occupy LA and Occupy Long Beach most recently. I will give a Marxist analysis of the class character of the movement and some of the ongoing political developments. But I don't want to take up too much time. I'm going to go right into it because I think we have a lot to gain from an open discussion and hearing what everyone else has to say about the occupations. Occupy Wall Street began their occupation with just a few hundred people on September 17th. At the time, they had not formulated political demands or a declaration, which they now have, but they maintained a presence in Zuccotti Park, which is private property nearby Wall Street. Over time, the number of occupiers grew well into the hundreds with a small encampment of tents. Their chosen target, Wall Street, represented the first explicit expression of the heightening consciousness of the working class over the last several years of bailouts, bourgeois electoral stunts, and constant attacks on workers' access to basic necessities like healthcare, housing, jobs, and education. The movement and tactic of occupation draws inspiration from the tactics used in what is now widely called the Arab Spring, more specifically the occupation of Tahrir Square in Egypt that led to the ejection of U.S. client and dictator Hosni Mubarak. Protesters throughout the country have cited several other ongoing political struggles for their source of inspiration, including protest movements in Tunisia, Greece, France, the UK, the Spanish Encampadas, Honduras, Chile, Palestine, and many other countries where movements against capitalist austerity and imperialism have heated up in the last few years. It's been said that the movements in Europe and oppressed nations have historically boomeranged back to the US, and we can see the beginning of that now. Conversely, the start of a militant and generally anti-capitalist movement in the US has emboldened protest movements around the world. On September 26, the US government under the Obama administration confirmed what we as Marxists and materialists already knew. We are not living in a post-racial society. The unjust and racist execution of Troy Davis was a glaring example of the ongoing existence of legal lynching and systematic repression. This was met with a march through Manhattan on September 27th, largely led by Answer Coalition and the Party for Socialism and Liberation, that finished by joining Occupy Wall Street at Zuccotti Park. This march and connection between the issues changed the character of Occupy Wall Street from a modest occupation into a militant movement that was willing to address the issues affecting every sector of the working class. This shift in character was pushed further when multiple unions joined the protest over the course of that week, forging a link that has persisted in nearly every city between organized labor and the occupations. What is uniting these forces is the widespread recognition of the fact that all of us, workers and students, share one common enemy, Wall Street, the beating heart of American capitalism and imperialism. In the final week of September, the Occupy Wall Street movement was met with continuous attacks from police. These attacks included dozens of false arrests, beatings, protesters run over by motorcycles, and the indiscriminate use of pepper spray on large crowds for no reason at all. These attacks were widely broadcast on mass media, alternative media, and social networking sites. As the attacks continued on the peaceful demonstrators, people became enraged, and occupations were prepared for in Los Angeles and Chicago on October 1st. On that day, nearly 2,000 people marched in Los Angeles and in Chicago to their respective occupation sites and began to occupy. Here in LA, the Answer Coalition emceed the Speak Out and program at LA City Hall that included Ron Kovic, Marcy Winograd, Kevin Baker, March Forward, and Peter Lindsay from Answer Coalition, among many other individuals that came up to share why they are part of the occupation movement. The police repression did not stop when the movement spread, though. In fact, on October 1st, NYPD sharpened the struggle when they executed a premeditated operation in an attempt to crush Occupy Wall Street. 2 marches were being held simultaneously throughout New York to garner mass support and attention to Occupy Wall Street. One march with members of the Answer Coalition and PSL literally on the front lines, as you saw in the video. Some of our members were the first ones arrested. was corralled by NYPD onto the Brooklyn Bridge, where an illegal mass arrest was carried out of more than 700 protesters. Our comrades in New York led militant resistance to the arrest, interlocking arms to form one solid mass that the police spent hours ripping apart. Since then, the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund, a group of leading civil rights attorneys that work with the Answer Coalition in DC and as legal advisors to Answer throughout the nation, took up a class action suit against NYPD and the city of New York. Our comrades in New York reported that the experience only heightened the militancy and unity of protesters and furthered their own cause. As a matter of fact, Occupy Wall Street led a march the following day on October 2nd on NYPD headquarters to demand an end to ongoing brutality and false arrests. October 2nd was also a day when veterans announced quite publicly that they were on the side of Occupy Wall Street and went down to be the first line of defense for the people against any further police repression. The inclusion of anti-war and anti-capitalist veterans has since been a widespread feature in occupations throughout the country, including participation of March Forward members. On October 3rd, at the prompting of Answer Coalition organizers and PSL members, there were solidarity marches in Los Angeles and Chicago to demand an end to repression of the movement and a dropping of all the charges against the 700 arrested. The march here in LA was led by Answer Coalition without a permit, with over 700 participants, and shut down all the major arteries of downtown LA, including Broadway Avenue, finishing at the encampment with a militant speak-out that included members of UTLA, representatives of the Prison Solidarity Movement, high school students, PSL members, union organizers, anti-war veterans, immigrant rights activists, and many others. On October 5th, a march of 50,000 in New York was once again brutally attacked by NYPD. But these attacks were met with a further spreading of the movement. On October 6th, Occupy DC began. On October 7th, occupations and occupation contingents joined the Answer Coalition's National Day of Action against the war in Afghanistan that has raged for 10 years, drawing the connections between imperialist war and Wall Street profit. By October 8th, there were occupation movements formed in San Francisco, Oakland, Portland, Seattle, Boston, Milwaukee, Detroit, Denver, San Diego, Phoenix, and Miami, among too many others to count throughout the Midwest and South. Their experiences ranged from the experiences of those in San Francisco being immediately repressed and having to regroup over the first week of occupation. The good news being that they have secured their encampment and cops have realized that they can't stop it, because if they kick them out or arrest them, they'll simply return. To the massive turnout in Portland of over 10,000 on the first day. That's been the range of occupations. Encampments in major cities now have hundreds of occupiers and tents, and actions are continuing to take place on a fairly constant basis throughout the country. Marches in smaller cities to build toward occupation occurred throughout Southern California, including in Long Beach and Riverside on October 8th, that brought out hundreds of people. Police repression was as widespread as the spreading of the movement, and was intensified on October 10th, when the Boston police, at the order of the mayor and the chief of police, attacked Occupy Boston violently, removing anti-war veterans, other demonstrators, and even arresting National Lawyers Guild observers. Protesters in Boston have faced repeated mass arrests since then of nearly 200 people at a time, but are continuing to hold their occupation and take action throughout the city despite this. Solidarity demonstrations with Boston took place throughout the country, including here in Los Angeles, around City Hall, where some of the first and clear chants against police brutality could be heard, a step forward for Occupy LA and other occupations. On that same day, Occupy Wall Street showed heightened political consciousness as they marched in solidarity with the indigenous to denounce Columbus Day and demand that it be torn off the calendar once and for all. This was followed up on October 12th with a mass march of tens of thousands on the homes of local billionaires in New York, including Rupert Murdoch, David Koch, John Paulson, Howard Milstein, the CEO of New York Private Bank and Trust, and Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan. This demonstration brought the disaffected masses to the doorstep of some of the criminals that caused the crisis and are continuing to benefit from it. It was a moment of clarity for the working class as they stepped into the immediate realm of the people who are normally cloistered up at the top, inside of comfortable boardrooms, free of any physical threat, while destroying our society and our class. This action must have been too much for the bourgeoisie to tolerate, as Mayor Bloomberg announced his intention to the following day, October 13th, that's yesterday, to clear out Zuccotti Park to be cleaned due to unsanitary conditions. The attempt to clear the park came just days before an announced day of global protest for all occupations. Emboldened and steeled in the weeks of struggle that had passed, Occupy Wall Street called Bloomberg's bluff and announced that not only did they refuse to leave by the deadline of 7 a.m. today, October 14th, but that they were also going to organize as many people as necessary to hold the occupation. Despite the most violent attack yet from the police last night, masses poured into the ranks of Occupy Wall Street throughout the night, and by 6 a.m. there were nearly 5,000 people holding the occupation. After it was announced that the owners of the park, Mayor Bloomberg, and the police were forced to back off, step down, a victory march of thousands took to the streets of New York. Solidarity demonstrations also took place last night throughout the country, including here in Los Angeles. Now we all have October 15th to look forward to. Tomorrow, that's the day of global protest with coordinated action throughout the country and other parts of the world. This is by no means an all-inclusive timeline of the occupation movement. It is a brief snapshot of the course of the movement thus far that attempts to highlight some major events and developments. Now I'm going to turn to some points of analysis. Not every occupation movement is exactly the same. That is inevitable as occupiers face different conditions in every locality, ranging from different political forces, different levels of established movement, varying relations with police and bourgeois politicians, as well as different sectors of the working class represented in different cities. Zuccotti Park, for instance, in New York is private property that the owners have agreed to allow occupiers to use. In Los Angeles, the occupiers have received permits and continue to work with the police to maintain their permitted presence. In most cities, however, around the country, the occupations are not permitted either by private owners or the police. Los Angeles is also unique in the degree to which they have become involved with local bourgeois politicians, especially the city council. The LA City Council passed a resolution expressing support for Occupy LA, and several members of city council have toured the encampment to shake some hands and smile. The general composition in each city varies in terms of multinational representation. Most cities have incorporated many students that have been barred from a semi-privileged future by the ongoing economic crisis that some term the middle class, though the term is meaningless for us as Marxists who have a different view of class divisions than one dependent on vague income brackets. The demonstrations have also brought out many veterans and rank-and-file union workers and organizers, but this composition is not consistent in every city. For example, San Francisco is largely an encampment of homeless youth and unemployed workers, who are also becoming increasingly represented at Occupy LA and other occupations throughout the country. As for the class characterization of the occupation movement, it is important for us to depart from a Marxist perspective in order to clear up some of the slander that the bourgeois press and some bad forces within the movement have promoted. Our view on class is generally simple. There are owners and workers, people who gain all of their wealth by simply having legal title to the means of production. Factories, finance capital, natural resources, etc. are owners. Workers include pretty much everyone else. Any person that has to work for a wage or salary to survive is a worker. We believe students are workers in training, preparing to be exploited by selling their labor as well. Thus, a person's class is not determined by their income, but by their social position. And this has many implications for the occupation movement in terms of analysis. First off, the bourgeois press has tried to paint the movement as nothing more than a middle-class white movement, a democratic, liberal response to the Tea Party movement, led by privileged neo-hippie kids who have just recently been thrown into poverty due to economic crisis. Some forces have mistakenly taken up this analysis and forwarded it in a truly sectarian display. First, this is not entirely true. As I have mentioned, and as we know from internal reports from occupations around the country, the composition includes, especially at demonstrations, union workers, oppressed people, veterans, students, unemployed people, homeless, and others. And to the extent that the middle class fallout theory is true, it is important to view this, because we're Marxist, to be a welcome development in the ongoing struggle towards socialism. Hostility to these new masses of people will only increase division and alienation within the working class as a whole. These forces in particular are awakening to the true problems in society that are now starting to take action. It's our responsibility as socialists to try to heighten the political consciousness of these sectors especially. And the fact that this movement has taken aim at the heart of world capitalism is a good sign. Furthermore, we must examine and analyze this movement based on its ongoing political developments. And we can see hints of true class consciousness in their document that I spoke of before, their declaration, called the Declaration of the Occupation of New York City. This movement is developing very quickly, and we have to continue to monitor and adjust to the material conditions that actually exist, not brush it off prematurely or denounce it for what limitations that exist at the time, because we know that those limitations can potentially be quickly broken down. Some grievances included in the declaration, which was passed on September 29th and publicly announced on the 30th, are as follows. The mass theft of homes, the bank bailouts, promotion of gender inequality, monopolization of big agribusiness, destruction of workers' rights, student debt, job outsourcing, corporate personhood, economic policy, political corruption and lobbying, blocking of alternative energy development in the interest of profit, blocking medical advancements in the interest of profit, purposefully covering up oil spills and tax evasion, corporate-controlled media, perpetuation of colonialism, torture and murder of innocent civilians abroad, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction for profit, the racist death penalty, and the cruel treatment of animals in the interest of profit. Now, I hope you all noticed something that was common with all of these grievances. Almost all of them are directly related to the system of capitalism, the system that puts profits before people's needs. Some demands released include universal health care and widespread student debt forgiveness and free education through university level, as well as an end to the racist death penalty. These are steps forward in the consciousness of the working class in general and in terms of demands, and we should promote this anti-capitalist line of thinking. We should, however, come to this movement with some amount of criticism, not to attack the movement, but in an attempt to refine it going forward and enhance its political development. With that said, I'd like to discuss just a few of the limitations that have seemed to come up in the Occupy Wall Street movement, not just here in Los Angeles, but also in other places as well. The first I already mentioned when I described our position as Marxist on the definition of class. The formulation of the 99% versus the 1% highlights an important fact about wealth disparity. 1% of people at the top control over 40% of all the wealth in our society, at the expense of the remaining 99%. But this defines our friends and our foes based solely on their income, not on their position in society and their class motivation. When you consider the fact that CEOs make about 500 times as much money as an average worker in the US, you come to the realization that there are plenty of capitalists that don't make it into the top 1%, but that participate in the mass exploitation of the working class still. Furthermore, despite the fact that the cops fall into the 99% income bracket, we risk a great deal by considering them part of our movement or part of the working class in general. Their position in society requires them to uphold the status quo, and they have done it historically by shedding the blood of workers and students, and we can't forget this. But we don't have to look at historical examples either, because we can look at how the police are interacting with the Occupy Wall Street movement around the country right now. It's like an abusive relationship in some cities, like Boston, where after they are beaten and mass arrested, they still identify the police as their friends. In other cities like New York, they have led marches on NYPD in response to police repression, showing the range of political development in different cities. It is clear that this point needs political refinement, and it will require people who understand the role of police in society to struggle in a principled way for correct ideas. As socialists, we can help with this, but we have to also recognize that experience in the struggle will expose this relationship to the masses of people that are in the streets, feeling the baton come down on their skulls and the chemicals sprayed into their eyes will be the quickest lesson. Both of these points implore us as socialists to try to promote a Marxist class perspective as much as possible to clarify the struggle going forward. We also have to recognize that this movement was pushed to the fore in response to the fact that people recognize that neither of the pro-capitalist parties, Republican or Democrat, are able to solve this crisis, nor do they care to work in our interests. With that said, we have to be weary going forward, especially toward a major election year, of attempts to co-opt the movement by liberals, especially the Democrats. This is and should remain an independent movement of the masses for real gains. With that said, the final and most significant limitation right now is the lack of political demands. New York has put out some, but most other cities, actually all of them, have not put out any. This is an inherent problem per se, because most people at the occupations this is not an inherent problem per se, because most people at the occupations recognize the need to develop political demands. Our demands are the unifying element of our movement, and therefore one of the most critical points. How can we expect to pull out the support of the entire working class if they don't know yet what we're fighting for in a more specific sense? This, however, will develop going forward because it must. Otherwise, it will go down as a utopian experiment centered around a tactic rather than a political issue. So keeping both the potential of this exciting movement and its current limitations in mind, where do we go from here? I believe our comrade in New York, Marcel Cartier, who has been a principal leader of Occupy Wall Street, he was the first guy that you saw arrested in that New York demonstration, said it best on Russia Today when he said that the next step is to, quote, organize, organize, organize. We recognize that this is a nascent but promising movement. It must develop organizationally to be able to grow and respond effectively to the obstacles that will be thrown at it from the system. We also know that as it develops organizationally around the country, it will also develop politically. And we should be as involved in this process as possible so that we as socialists can direct people to the real problem, capitalism, and more importantly, to the only solution, and that solution is socialism.